After World War I, the Dutch recognised the need to modernise their small fleet, technological progress having obsoleted almost anything built before 1910 and quite a few ships built later across the world. Whilst the attempt at the time to acquire battleships or battle cruisers hadn't worked out, a pair of new Java-class cruisers were laid down during the interwar period. But with only 2 ships, you couldn't guarantee a modern cruiser on station in the Dutch East Indies at all times. This meant that at least a 3rd ship was needed. In theory, the Netherlands was not bound by the treaty restrictions on cruiser size, but this was balanced against her own industrial limitations, and especially finance. Coupled with the order coming in the midst of the Great Depression, the new ship, de Ruyter, would not be anything close to the 10,000-ton treaty limit, let alone larger. Indeed, the fact that she was alone instead of part of another pair also reflected the tight confines of the Dutch naval budget at the time. Exactly what the ship would actually be also varied quite considerably. Early designs called for a heavy cruiser with 8-inch guns, which then swung all the way down to a 6-gun light cruiser. The Dutch Navy managed to argue a 4th turret back in, but this required them to accept only a single gun in the said turret, and protection and any other armament was almost non-existent, albeit they could take a crumb of comfort in there being plenty of space left in the ship as a result, should better circumstances arise later and new weapons be acquired for installation. Laid down in September 1933, launched in March 1935 and commissioned in October 1936, the ship displaced just under 6,500 tons standard and was armed with 7 150mm or 5.9-inch guns, 4 aft in twin superfiring turrets and 3 forward with a single superfiring over a twin, although the single was closer to a mount than an actual turret. There was no heavy anti-aircraft guns, secondary battery or torpedo tubes, the remaining weaponry consisting of a small nest of 10 40mm Bofors in 5 twin mounts clustered on the aft superstructure and a number of 50 cal machine guns scattered elsewhere. Amidships there were facilities for 2 aircraft, although in practice she seems to have normally carried just the 1. Armour was thin, with a 2-inch belt and 1.2 inches on the deck and turrets, which made the vital parts splinter-proof, and that was about it, maybe offering a little bit of protection from destroyer guns at longer ranges. 66,000 shaft horsepower drove twin screws for a top speed of about 32 knots. She would spend most of the late 1930s patrolling the Dutch East Indies, and would still be there when the first Dutch ships received word that Germany had invaded their homeland. They elected to remain active and hostile to Axis interests, hunting where possible for Italian and German vessels that might be in range, whilst keeping an eye on what was now the last major collection of Dutch-held land. But the end of 1941 brought the Japanese entry into the war, and it was pretty clear that the oil fields of the land they'd been charged to protect would be pretty high on the Japanese Navy's target list. Taking advantage of the short time they had before the Japanese Navy came knocking, de Ruyter quickly overhauled her machinery and sailed to join ABDA Command, the scratch force of anyone in the area who was opposing the Japanese advance. After a few convoy escort runs, the expected enemy forces began to appear, and her first offensive action was in the Battle of the Makassar Strait, also known as the Battle of the Flores Sea, when 4 ABDA cruisers and 7 destroyers attempted to intercept a Japanese troop convoy, but were met by several dozen Japanese twin-engine bombers. With minimal heavy anti-aircraft weaponry across the fleet and no fighter support, the Allied vessels could only largely watch as first USS Marblehead and then USS Houston were mobbed, hit, and forced to withdraw. De Ruyter sustained some light damage, but was still able to fight. But Admiral Doorman recognised that another such attack would likely be the end of his squadron to no avail, and the fleet withdrew. A couple of weeks later, and with many ships still repairing, another Japanese attack convoy appeared, and Doorman tried to deploy everything still capable of action. But this resulted in 3 individual waves of attack, so whilst in theory it was 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers plus submarines and aircraft against a mere 4 Japanese destroyers, ABDA Command lost a destroyer immediately, and another was damaged such that it wouldn't fight again, and had the light cruiser Tromp damaged and forced to withdraw, in exchange for only damaging 3 Japanese destroyers and 1 transport. Just over a week later, the last major remaining ABDA ships were gathered together for one last attempt to stop yet another Japanese invasion convoy, resulting in the Battle of the Java Sea. Gunfire and torpedoes were sent back and forth for most of the day, with the Allied ships definitely getting the worst of it, until in the last exchange of the action, just after 2300 at night, a final wave of long lances managed to hit both De Ruyter and Java. The small cruiser's anti-torpedo defences were no match for the heavy Japanese weapons, and De Ruyter rolled over and sank in short order, taking most of her crew, including Admiral Dorman, with her. The wreck would be rediscovered in 2002 and designated as a war grave, but unfortunately, as with HMS Exeter and a number of other ships sunk in the area, she has subsequently been destroyed by grave robbers.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.